that we were anticipating replacing? What revenues were coming short that we were going to use those from?
And so I didn't bring those specific calculations with me, but just right off the bat that I can recall, the mixed drink tax, the beer tax, the alcohol licensing tax. We also had a shortage in our court fees, court costs, fines and forfeitures, or seizures, because our courts were closed. Those were some of the big things that I can think of right off the top of my head where we had specific impacts from the pandemic that would affect those specific revenue streams. And if you recall, I think during one of our discussions, Councilman Carlisle and I kind of reviewed some of those that I went through that specifically changed that calculation. Interestingly enough, one of the allowed calculations under the new guidelines is state revenue. So for us in FY19, we received $7.8 million in state holiday tax. Well, you would absolutely think that has nothing to do with the pandemic. This was a phase out of revenue that was regulated, certainly out of our control. But according to the guidelines, that can be used in the calculation of your base revenues. And I could put a growth to it. So there were some advantages and disadvantages, but you really lose sight of those for the general fund when you make it entity-wide. And it's what Councilman Morgan has alluded to. I've kind of shown him the work that I've gone through, specifically for our sewer, where we raised fees. If you compare revenues to FY19, even if you give them the allowed growth rate, they're still significantly below what they call our actual revenues for the calendar year 2020. But I have to include those revenues in our formula calculation, which can skew the calculations. So for those, when we originally looked at the 18 million, those were kind of some of the high level lines that it was readily apparent that we had a loss of revenue from the impact of the pandemic. In our new guidelines, even though the overall arching is to stabilize governments after the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, they also clearly state that any reduction in revenue for ease of burden of calculations could be considered as loss from the impact of the COVID-19. So I realize that these are federal guidelines and it's across a lot of states and not just Tennessee. Different states have different regulations, and I think, from their perspective, they were probably trying to smooth those out. But it certainly creates issues for states like ours, where we do have the option of what they call a piggyback tax, or the local option sales tax. But again, we didn't just exercise that option for the benefit of general revenues. That was very specific, related to a referendum that was elected by the people. So there are just some qualifiers, and I think very similar to the CARES Act guidelines. As we continued, as these types of questions came up and the guidelines got more specific, they either narrowed in their definition for clarity or they broadened in their definition for clarity. And our hope is that, one, we will receive some additional guidance related specifically to the potential of revenue replacement into our budgets, or that I get the comptroller's office to agree with my methodology. We record it and with it. But obviously, the last approval from your approved budget is the state comptroller's office. So I think it behooves us to continue to work with them and to communicate with them on what our budget will look like, specifically related to the ARPA potential replacement revenue and any use of our unassigned fund balance.
Yeah. And to Chief Ford's last point, which is really important, this is $24 million, which is about 3% of our total general fund budget. So it's not from that perspective, it doesn't seem like a significant amount, but it is about 25% of our reserve fund. And even if we were to try to, use reserve funds for this and then work it out with the federal government over the course of the year, it wouldn't be much of a problem for us until the fourth quarter. It'd really just be on paper until we got to that spending level of 97% of the budget. But the state comptroller's office isn't going to allow us to do that, and they have final approval authority of our budget if they know that our budget isn't balanced, if they can see that these revenues likely aren't going to be an allowable use. And so we have to go with the best guidance that we have at the time, which unfortunately leaves us with the word I've been using over and over again the last week, a bit of uncertainty. And we're going to do our best to be, I think, responsible to the guidance that we have, and that means being maybe more defensive or protective of the situation we're in rather than hopeful. And I don't think it's a good practice in budget to just be crossing your fingers and wishing for the best. So I will now go to council members for comments or questions. There's a lot to absorb. Councilman Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ford, what is not allowed as far as some general revenues?
So in its basic, for the introduction of revenues that are included in the Census Bureau, it defines general revenue, which pertains to the general government sector and is classified by a specific type, such as taxes, intergovernmental revenues, current charges, and miscellaneous general revenue. So for its definition, general revenue comprises all revenue except that classified as a liquor store, utility, or insurance trust revenue. And then for the basis of the distinction is the nature of the revenue source involved, not the fund or administrative unit established to account for and control a particular activity. And it sounds very broad, and it is. I mean, I'm sorry you asked me, right? I know. But this is about, 60 pages of definitions that can tell, like, for instance, specific to what is considered is if the state collects a tax imposed by local governments, the collection and distribution to the imposing local government is treated as an agency transaction. That is, the receipts are reported entirely as tax revenue of the local government, which is us, and not either as a state tax or state intergovernmental expenditure. These situations occur where a local government might impose a piggyback tax, always with approval, onto a state tax. Common examples are local option sales tax and local option income tax. But then it goes on to define in other pieces of the revenue things that cannot be included. And unfortunately, there weren't near as many exclusions as there were inclusions. Some of the exclusions related to money that was received through a state grant that was funded by a federal grant, because they kind of pulled it. And for us internally, revenues, and you see this frequently on our statements, our budget statements, where we transfer funds from one fund to another. If those are intergovernmental, you just count the revenue one time. So there's some of those exclusions that go in. The things that were excluded specifically by the interim ruling were pension fund, like none of this can ever be used to deposit into a pension fund, and the intergovernmental, those types where like our fleet revenue is derived by charging, other divisions, that revenue would be excluded.
Okay. Has there been any update? Because I think that when, and I haven't paid too much attention to, unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say this, what's going on across the street is that they had a projected rate of 350, but it came back at 345. Do we have any updates on our side?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So our initial, when we first looked at that, we thought we would land somewhere between 275 and something, but our calculations to date are 2.714684, and I think that might have gotten adjusted a little bit yesterday, but to 2.713, but it's not going to change it dramatically. And so that's where we are. We're getting ready to certify that rate because we think that's the last change that we are possibly going to be able to have to our rate.
Okay. And then going back to the value of a penny, what is that?
Approximately $1.4 million.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other council members? Question or comments? Do we have anybody on the queue online? Councilman Warren?
If there's a way that we potentially could get talking points that we could take to our federal legislators, that would be very helpful, something that they could understand and we could communicate. That may have to bring it down to a level that I could understand and communicate, but because a lot of this just seems like it's definitions and accounting 101 and or maybe advanced accounting. Yeah, pretty advanced. But I mean, I just think that we have the ability, I think, and that's what we should do as a council, is try to see what we can do to get our legislators to go to the people who are making the bureaucratic rules and let them understand that this is very important to try to keep the city governments and county governments afloat to get this right. And it doesn't sound like they necessarily got it right. Every time they tend to do something, it sounds like they're getting it more wrong. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councilman Warren. We are actually, from our conversation this morning with another one of the representatives, in the process of creating kind of like a one-page summary fact sheet of some of the challenges that this interim ruling is providing for us at the municipal level. And we would be more than glad to share that and post it on the light poles and everywhere else. But we would certainly encourage and welcome your assistance in reaching out to any contacts you have to let them know of the challenges that this interim ruling is providing for us.
Thank you. Councilman Carlisle?
Thank you, Chairman. Chief Ford, when do you typically close out your books? When do you expect to have that?
For a fiscal year or a month?
For I guess, the period ending December 31st, 2021, or 2020.
So for a monthly, that's just a general month closing for us, usually by the 6th day of the following month. Okay. So usually within a week of the end of the calendar month.
What's the plan? We're focused a lot on the ARPA revenue replacement in this conversation, but it doesn't change the fact that we're $5 million short from the state government. So all things being equal, if you're to get guidance that was favorable to the $18.18 million, what's the plan for the $5 million deficit from the state?
That is something that we would have to address in this budget, either as a use of fund balance or to find $5 million in cuts.
Oh, I hear a lot of we now. I hear a lot of we now. Okay, and then you mentioned this earlier, and I'll have to pull that, but for us, healthcare, fleet, pension, and did you mention unemployment in there? Yes. Okay. Sorry. Pension. I think I'm good.
All right. Thank you. Councilman Ford?
Thank you. Ms. Ford, if we did option 1 from the unassigned fund balance, what would it do to our rating?
Well, that's a very good question, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
I brought it up where everybody understands.
Yes, okay, thank you. So if you recall, last year when we approved use of fund balance, those are the numbers that I had to go forward with all of our bond ratings for this past year. We have not been downgraded, but I also assured our rating agencies that this is a drastic measure, and they were very well aware that municipalities across the United States were having to use fund balance to address some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, recent ratings, which included the Liberty Park revenue bonds and also the Accelerate Memphis bond issues, we were able to share with them that we did not, or we are not projecting to have to use any of our unassigned fund balance to close out FY21, to which they were very surprised and very congratulatory. So I think even if we compared with where we planned to be for FY21 with a use and a potential use in FY22 of fund balance, that I would be able, I think, to communicate with our bond rating agencies the issues that we have come, and I do not think it would be detrimental to us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. Councilman Warren?
Yes. As we were talking about the federal issue, is there anything bothering our state government about the $5 million, or is that a done deal?
Their budget has been passed, so I think that's a done deal.
So it's a done deal. Their budget was passed by the legislature?
Yes.
And they took it out at that time?
Yes.
Yeah.
And redirected it to?
That I cannot answer for you, sir. I do not know.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I can't say how it's redirected, but I'll try to get an answer to that. And two, I'm not trying to rush to their defense, but at the time the cut was made, they were under the same impression we were, that the federal money was going to make us whole in terms of revenue replacement. And so that was a lot of the public justification and debate around the cut, was that these municipalities were going to be okay because of the federal funding. So they were under the same presumption we were as this budget was being proposed and we were debating it just a few weeks ago. All right, Councilwoman Johnson.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mrs. Ford, for all your work. I know it's a lot under the circumstances, but I know you're able, so we're depending on you, okay? Now, my question is, I'm concerned about the CARES funds we already have. Have we used all those up? Can we be accountable for those funds?
Yes, ma'am. We have, from our CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund, it was approximately $116 million. We allocated through this council all of those funds in January of this year. We are down to kind of our final spending on that. There are some contracts with UTC that we still have related to testing and some of the vaccines that were covered under that initial projection. But for all practical purposes, we have exhausted those funds. And we will be glad to give you a wrap up at the end of the year to show you where all those funds went. They followed your allocation as of January.
Great. With your ARPA funds, is it possible to give any additional increases to the employees or something if you're not going to be able to use it for revenue replacement? Is there any way to reallocate those funds in some other areas that could offset it? I mean, are you thinking in that way?
So one of the things that did not change dramatically from the initial or from the first announcement to the initial final rule was the application of what they call premium pay for employees. Mm-hmm. And as this council is aware, the mayor has proposed approximately $16 million to be paid out to employees other than police and fire who, in his eyes, were also responsive to the pandemic. And that amount was calculated as kind of an offset to the proposed retain and recruitment bonuses that were going to be used from the referendum funds. But yes, ma'am, if we are sitting at 80 million, which we have received now, and we're not sure where all those uses can be, the one thing we are sure of is the premium pay. That really hasn't changed from the initial ruling.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Councilwoman, and thank you for the call.
Thank you. Councilman Carlisle?
Thank you, Chair. Fund 245, how was that established? Was that established between the administration and the comptroller's office?
Yes, and it's actually given in guidance by the GFOA. Anytime you have a specific revenue stream that can only be used in a specific way, it has to be established as a special revenue fund.
I think that's maybe the great debate too, right? I think Alan Wade would take the position that it's the council's authority to appropriate those funds as the council sees fit, and that the only thing that was authorized in the referendum was an increase in the sales tax option. And, you know, I don't want to get deep down the road because Shirley's going to make a case that it can only be used for those funds. But I think that means the council has to maybe potentially have to acquiesce its position that it's up to the council how those funds are spent. It's a catch-22 I think for us. Maybe we should have probably some discussion later with Alan, maybe in a closed meeting, because I don't want to eviscerate Shirley's position. But it's an interesting dynamic. Yeah, Shirley, or Chief Ford, I'm casual. Chief Ford, I do appreciate all the hard work. This has been challenging 2 years, and watching the federal government do things on the fly is entertaining and also makes you want to weep. But, you know, I know the council is committed to figuring out how to work through this. And like Councilman Morgan said, you know, responsibly, it's just a lot to digest, I think. So I yield back.
Okay. Thank you. If we do have that discussion with Councilor Wade, we maybe would be able to have it in a closed door session because of the undoubtedly there would be a lawsuit to follow from the associations that were responsible for passing that referendum. And in fact, that's already been discussed publicly, I think, on the record. But we don't want to do anything that would violate sunshine laws, which brings me to my next point. So if you look at the sheet that the administration passed out, you'll see the public works salaries adjustment of $1 million that Chief Ford briefly went over. You know, that was an example where public works salaries is not being cut. We think they just misbudgeted. We think they projected their expenses for next year incorrectly, that they were missing a line item, and upon further investigation, that was the case. If any council members with this delay that we're looking at here have questions about budgets where they think there have been other mistakes made, other savings that could be realized, or other cuts that wouldn't affect critical services, please coordinate with the administration and bring those to them as to not violate sunshine laws, because those are things that they are certainly going to be looking at over the next 2 weeks as they consider options 1, 2, and 3. And it may end up being that we have to do a combination thereof. And so there may be some cuts that are simply, such as that public works salary, $1 million accounting error, that we may be able to help with some of this offset. So sorry if I just put that on y'all, but council members contact Shirley's office rather than myself, so we can avoid any sunshine conflicts, and then we will talk about it in an open meeting and potentially amend the budget there. Are there any other comments or questions from council members? It's okay. So the plan is it's not the intent to take any vote today. When we come to City Council we will not have a wrap-up session tomorrow. That was on the schedule if needed. When we come to Council on June 1st, we have a number of resolutions and ordinances related to the budget on their third or final reading, and we will hold those if it is the will of the council. Hopefully it is, because we do not have a budget until June 15th. And then on June 8th, 2 weeks from today, we will be back here with wrap-up to do CIP, to do operating. And at that point, I think we have to proceed forward regardless of how murky the guidance might be. We have to pass a budget by June 30th. And our last scheduled council meeting is June 15th. We could legally get into calling emergency meetings later in June, but I don't think that would be advisable. And I don't think we should pin our hopes on something being cleared up between June 15th and June whatever. So I think we're just going to have to bite the bullet, so to speak, and go with our best good faith effort on June 15th and in agreement with the administration or not, depending on what they propose. So that is the plan. If council members have ideas or proposals about the budget, we can certainly talk about it in the next budget committee. Anytime I ask any further business for this committee, that would be a terrific time to bring it up. And between now and then, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out and request information from staff, from the administration. We'll do everything possible to make sure that this council is as informed as possible to make a good decision for this next year's budget. Councilman Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to what was some initial, I guess, some other budget presentations, and with this new guidance, I think that there was some planned use of these funds for the TDZ and the hotel motel. How is that affected? So I don't think we've talked about that.
Excellent question.
Okay.
So as in accordance with the initial ruling, those revenues have to be included in our entity-wide calculations. So one of the, we have both our legal team and the comptroller's team kind of honing in on this question for us, that we think we have found a way that those monies can be specific to the downtown TDZ revenue replacement. As to the hotel motel, that part of the calculation, if you look at it as a separate entity, definitely has revenue replacement due it, and it contributes to our overall calculation. So it might not be the exact amount that we thought originally could be, by a specific line item, because now it has to be allocated from an entity-wide calculation. But we do anticipate that there would be specific revenue replacement to the hotel motel.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
But at this point, we don't know how close, whether it's half, 25%, 75%. Okay.
That's correct. Yes, sir. Councilman Jones.
All right. Thank you very much. That was a great question. And if y'all could, yourself and Chief Madden can get that one pager to us to help lobby on the city's behalf, that would be particularly helpful. Any other business for this committee? All right. Seeing none, we're adjourned, everybody. Thank you.